The morning of November 24th, 1944. Over the outskirts of Tokyo, the air trembled with a sound the Japanese people had never heard before, a deep, resonant thunder that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Factory workers looked up from their benches. Mothers clutched their children. Air raid sirens wailed across the capital, but this was different from the drills, different from the warnings they'd grown accustomed to ignoring. At 30,000 feet, where the air was thin enough to see the curvature of the Earth, 111 Boeing B-29 Superfortresses cruised toward their target at 220 miles per hour. The Musashino aircraft plant sprawled below them like a toy factory, its rooftops painted in camouflage that meant nothing from 6 miles up. In the cockpits, American pilots adjusted their oxygen masks and checked their instruments. The manifold pressure gauges held steady. The temperature needles sat in the green. The 4 Wright R-3350 engines on each aircraft hummed with a power that seemed almost effortless at this altitude. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. On the ground, Japanese fighter pilots sprinted toward their aircraft. The scramble order had come minutes ago, but minutes were everything. The Nakajima-Ki 44 Shoki interceptors were among the fastest climbing fighters in the Imperial Army Air Force. On paper, they could reach 10,000 meters. On paper, they were the answer to the B-29 problem. But paper doesn't account for physics, and physics was about to teach the Japanese defenders a lesson in brutal arithmetic. Captain Isamu Sasaki strapped into his Ki 44 at Chofu Airfield. He was one of the experienced pilots, a veteran of China with 7 confirmed kills. He knew his aircraft's capabilities down to the last meter per second of climb rate. 5,000 meters in just over 4 minutes. Excellent performance by any standard. But as his engine roared to life and his wheels left the runway, he was already calculating the intercept problem in his head. The math didn't work out the way headquarters wanted it to. The B-29 seconds weren't just flying high, they were flying fast. 310 knots, 357 miles per hour. Because while Captain Sasaki's fighter burned the standard Japanese C-3 aviation fuel, roughly equivalent to the Allied 100-octane grade, those American bombers were powered by something the Japanese command structure had not fully appreciated. Not the aircraft itself, though that was revolutionary. Not the pilots, though they were well trained, but the fuel in their tanks. 130-octane aviation gasoline, sometimes called performance number 100/130. The second number mattered more than the Japanese realized. Octane rating isn't about how much energy a fuel contains. It's about how much you can compress it before it detonates prematurely. Higher octane means higher compression ratios. Higher compression means more power from the same displacement. More power means higher speeds, better climb rates, and the ability to operate effectively at altitudes where lesser engines gasp for oxygen. The Wright R-3350 duplex cyclone engines in the B-29 were rated at 2,200 horsepower each on standard 100-octane fuel, but feed them 100/130 grade, and they could push manifold pressures higher without the engine eating itself from detonation. The practical result was simple. The B-29 could cruise at speeds that turned interception from a tactical problem into a geometric impossibility. Captain Sasaki's Ki 44 clawed for altitude. At ground level, his fighter was probably traveling around 180 miles per hour in its best climb configuration. Fast, by normal standards. Glacial when you're trying to catch something at 30,000 feet that's already accelerating away. Every minute he spent climbing, the B-29 formation traveled more than 5 miles. He wasn't chasing a target. He was chasing a memory of where the target used to be. At 20,000 feet, his engine was struggling. The thin air meant his supercharger was working overtime just to maintain power. His indicated airspeed showed 200 miles per hour, but true airspeed at altitude was higher. He had to accelerate from climb speed to combat speed. That took time. That took distance. That took fuel he couldn't spare. And those B-29 seconds weren't waiting around. They were on their bomb run now, and intelligence reports said they could dive slightly to accelerate even more if threatened. Below, in the operations rooms, Japanese radar operators tracked the American formation with growing dread. They'd known the B-29 was coming. The technology was understood, at least in theory. High-altitude bomber, pressurized crew compartments, heavy defensive armament. But knowing these facts was different from experiencing the tactical reality. The B-29 wasn't just better than Japanese bombers. It operated in a different realm of capability entirely. The few key 44 seconds that managed to climb to intercept altitude found themselves in a chase where overtaking the target required them to push their engines beyond safe limits. You could catch a B-29 if you were lucky, if you were already airborne and at altitude when they arrived, if your approach angle was perfect, if they didn't see you coming and adjust their speed. Too many ifs. Most interception attempts ended with the Japanese fighter running out of fuel before getting within gun range, or overshooting because closing speed was too high, or simply watching the American bombers sail past just out of reach. The defensive gunnery didn't help. The B-29 carried 10 50-caliber Browning machine guns in remote-controlled turrets. The General Electric fire control system computed ballistic corrections automatically. Lead angles, wind drift, target motion. The gunners sat in pressurized compartments, comfortable and alert, while Japanese fighter pilots struggled with oxygen systems and frostbite. At 20,000 feet, with combat closing speeds approaching 400 miles per hour, the engagement window was measured in seconds. A Japanese pilot had to thread through a cone of defensive fire, line up a deflection shot on a target the size of a warehouse that was moving nearly as fast as his own fighter, and hit something vital before overshooting or running out of ammunition. The B-29 just had to keep flying. By the time Captain Sasaki reached 25,000 feet, his engine temperature was redlining. He could see contrails ahead, streaks of frozen moisture marking the B-29 formation, but they were distant, moving away. He pushed his throttle forward, felt the engine protest with a surge of rough vibration. He could maybe reach 28,000 feet, maybe get close enough for one firing pass. Maybe. The bombers had already released their loads. He watched the bombs fall, tiny black dots that seemed to hang motionless before disappearing toward the city below. Down in Tokyo, the Musashino aircraft plant took hits. Not many. Only 24 of the 111 B-29 seconds managed to bomb the primary target. Bad weather, navigation errors, the challenges of high-altitude precision bombing. But the Japanese people saw those silver giants overhead, unreachable, unstoppable. And that psychological impact was worth more than the physical damage. Only one B-29 went down that day, 1 out of 111. The loss rate was less than 1%. For the Japanese defenders, it was a disaster. 125 fighters scrambled. Most never got close enough to shoot. Those that did found themselves outrun, outgunned, or simply too late. The Americans lost one bomber to operational difficulties, possibly mechanical failure, possibly a lucky hit from anti-aircraft fire. The exact cause remained unclear. What was clear was that conventional interception tactics weren't working. That evening, in debriefing rooms across Japanese airfields, pilots reported the same thing. The target was too fast, too high, too well defended. Commanding officers asked what could be done. The answer was brutal. Not much. Not with the aircraft they had. Not with the fuel they were using. Not with the tactics they'd developed for fighting bombers that flew at 15,000 feet and 200 miles per hour. The B-29 wasn't that kind of target. Behind the raw performance numbers was a supply chain story. The Japanese military intelligence officers were only beginning to grasp. American refineries could produce 100 to 30 octane fuel in quantities the Japanese could barely imagine. The process required catalytic cracking units, sophisticated chemical additives including tetraethyl lead, and access to high-quality crude oil or the industrial capacity to synthesize what nature didn't provide. Japan had none of these advantages. By 1944, Japanese aviation fuel production relied heavily on coal liquefaction plants in Manchuria. The Fischer-Tropsch process could turn coal into synthetic fuel, but the resulting product topped out around 90 to 95 octane, even with additives. The high-grade C3 fuel used by frontline fighters was roughly equivalent to American 100 octane. Japan simply couldn't produce the exotic high-performance fuels that powered the American air offensive. Even if they'd captured the chemical formulas, they lacked the industrial infrastructure to manufacture them at scale. This wasn't a problem that could be solved with better tactics or braver pilots. This was a problem of industrial capacity meeting the limits of chemistry and engineering. The American air campaign over Japan was powered by petroleum cracking towers in Texas, by refineries in California, by chemical plants that produced octane boosters by the tanker load. Every B-29 that flew over Tokyo carried in its fuel tanks the accumulated output of an industrial system the Japanese couldn't replicate and couldn't stop. The Wright R-3350 engines were themselves marvels of engineering, though they'd earned a reputation for temperamental behavior. 18 cylinders arranged in twin rows, 3,350 cubic inches of displacement, supercharged to maintain power at altitude. When they worked, they produced power that few radial engines could match. When they didn't work, they caught fire with an intensity that could burn through a wing spar in seconds. The high magnesium content in the crankcase meant engine fires sometimes reached 5,600 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to melt through aluminum structure before crews could react. But by late 1944, many of the early teething problems had been addressed. Fuel injection systems replaced the troublesome carburetors. Cooling modifications reduced the rear cylinder overheating that had plagued early operations. Time between overhauls increased from 100 hours to 400. The B-29 was maturing into a reliable strategic weapon, and that reliability, combined with its performance, made it nearly invulnerable to conventional defense. For Japanese engineers studying captured American documents and intelligence reports, the picture was clear and hopeless. The B-29 represented a convergence of technologies that Japan simply couldn't match. Pressurized crew compartments requiring sophisticated manufacturing tolerances, remote-controlled turrets with ballistic computers, high-altitude engines dependent on fuel grades beyond Japanese production capability. The aircraft wasn't just better in one dimension, it was better in every dimension that mattered for strategic bombing. Speed, altitude, range, payload, defensive armament, crew comfort, operational reliability. Pick any metric, and the B-29 came out ahead. Captain Sasaki landed back at Chofu, with his engine showing signs of stress from the prolonged high-altitude chase. His mechanic inspected the cylinders and shook his head. They'd need to replace 3 of them. Parts were scarce. The engine might be down for a week. And for what? One interception attempt that never got close to gun range, one more data point in a growing stack of after-action reports that all said the same thing. The B-29 was winning. In the weeks that followed, Japanese air defense commanders tried everything they could imagine. Fighter tactics shifted. Instead of trying to climb and chase, some units tried to position themselves ahead of the expected bomber track and dive from above. This worked occasionally, if radar gave enough warning, if the predicted course was accurate, if the fighters had enough fuel to loiter at altitude. But American bomber formations learned to vary their approach angles, to use weather as cover, to exploit the gaps in Japan's early warning network. Some pilots attempted ramming attacks, deliberate collisions where the fighter would try to take off a B-29's tail or wing. These succeeded a few times, but the loss rate for the attacking fighters was 100% by definition. You can't ram a bomber at 300 miles per hour and expect to walk away. Even when the ramming succeeded, one B-29 for one fighter was an exchange ratio Japan couldn't sustain. America was building hundreds of B-29 seconds. Japan was running out of experienced pilots. By December, the raids intensified. B-29 seconds struck from the Marianas, from bases on Saipan and Tinian where American engineers had carved bomber strips from volcanic rock and coral. The supply lines were secure. The fuel flowed steadily. Each mission refined tactics. Each mission gathered intelligence. Each mission demonstrated that Japanese air defenses couldn't stop what was coming. In war production facilities across Japan, workers started looking up at the sky with dread. The B-29 could appear anytime conditions were right. High altitude meant you couldn't hear them until they were almost overhead. By then, it was too late to do anything but hope. The fighters might scramble, the anti-aircraft guns might fire, but increasingly, those silver bombers just sailed through, dropped their loads, and flew home with damage that ranged from minor to non-existent. The fuel that powered this transformation had a history of its own. In the late 1930s, American oil companies and military planners realized that future air warfare would be won or lost based on engine performance. Higher octane fuels could unlock power that conventional gasoline couldn't touch. Shell Oil Company, with former Army aviator Jimmy Doolittle leading their aviation department, invested heavily in developing 100-octane fuel. The cost was astronomical. Early production ran over 100 times more expensive than regular automotive gasoline. But the performance gains were undeniable. By 1940, American refineries were producing 100-octane fuel for export to Britain. When Rolls-Royce modified their Merlin engines to take advantage of the higher octane ratings, Hurricane and Spitfire fighters suddenly gained 30 to 40 knots of speed and 500 to 1,000 feet per minute of climb rate. The Luftwaffe pilots who'd enjoyed a performance edge during the early Battle of Britain found that advantage evaporating. It wasn't new aircraft, it was new fuel in existing aircraft. That lesson wasn't lost on American military planners. The progression continued. 100-octane became 130. Experimental batches reached 150. Each increase required more sophisticated refining processes, more exotic additives, more careful handling procedures. The lead content in these high-performance processes, fuels created maintenance challenges. Deposits formed on cylinder heads and valves. The fuel itself was toxic enough to require special handling procedures. But for strategic bombers operating at the edge of their performance envelope, these were acceptable trade-offs. The B-29 program pushed engine technology to its limits. The R-3350 was designed in the late 1930s, but didn't enter full production until 1943. The engine proved temperamental. Early test flights revealed overheating problems. The rear cylinders, getting inadequate airflow from the close-fitting cowl, would overheat during takeoff climbs. The carburetor design caused fuel distribution problems. Valves would fail under stress, and when things went wrong, they went catastrophically wrong. The magnesium crankcase, chosen for weight savings, turned engine fires into infernos that could consume an aircraft in under a minute. General H.H. Arnold, commanding the Army Air Forces, pushed for the B-29 to enter service despite these problems. The strategic situation demanded it. Japan's empire was contracting, but their home islands remained out of reach for conventional bombers. The B-29 was supposed to bridge that gap, but the aircraft that arrived at operational units in 1944 were still plagued with mechanical issues. The in-commission rate, the percentage of aircraft actually able to fly, never exceeded 40% from October 1943 to September 1944. In July 44, only 27% of the B-29 fleet was mission-ready. In August, 36%. The Battle of Kansas, as aircraft plant workers called it, was an all-out effort to fix these problems. Boeing's Wichita facility became a modification center where aircraft rolled off the production line only to be immediately torn apart for upgrades. Clear panels in the cockpit were distorted, making landing difficult. Those got replaced and pressure tested. Engine components were strengthened. Cooling systems were redesigned. Fuel injection systems replaced the problematic carburetors. The work was frantic, expensive, and absolutely necessary. By the time B-29 seconds reached the Marianas in October 44, many issues had been addressed, but the engines remained the weak link. Pilots learned to baby their power settings during takeoff. Don't push the throttles forward too quickly. Don't overstress the engines during the initial climb. Monitor the cylinder head temperatures constantly. At the tropical airfields where B-29 seconds operated, ambient temperatures pushed the engines close to their operating limits before the aircraft even started rolling. Taking off at maximum weight in 90-degree heat with fuel loads that measured in thousands of gallons required precision throttle management and a little bit of luck. But once airborne and established at altitude, the B-29 transformed into something formidable. The 4 engines, each producing their rated power at manifold pressures that would destroy lesser engines, gave the aircraft a cruise speed few fighters could match and a top speed only the very best interceptors could exceed. And that was the key to its survivability. It didn't need to be faster than every Japanese fighter. It just needed to be fast enough that catching it required perfect conditions and execution. Japanese fighter development had followed a different philosophy. Zero fighters and their successors prioritized maneuverability and range over raw speed and firepower. When you're defending an empire stretched across the Pacific, range matters. When you're fighting lighter Allied fighters in turning combat, agility matters. But against a bomber that flies straight and level at 30,000 feet and 350 miles per hour, maneuverability doesn't help. You need speed, and you need altitude performance. Japan had fighters that could theoretically operate at those altitudes. The Ki-44 Shoki, the Ki-61 Hien, the later Ki-84 Hayate. But theoretical performance and practical interception capability were different things. The Nakajima Ki-84 Hayate was probably Japan's best all-around fighter of the war. It matched Allied fighters in most performance categories. Its operational ceiling theoretically enabled it to intercept B-29 seconds, but building aircraft in Japan by late 1944 meant dealing with material shortages, quality control problems, and increasingly desperate substitutions of substandard components. Ki-84 seconds coming off the production line had inconsistent performance. Some were excellent, others barely flew. Pilot training suffered similar degradation. The experienced aviators who'd fought in China and the early Pacific campaigns were largely dead. The replacements had 50 hours of flight time if they were lucky. Throwing green pilots in somewhat reliable aircraft against B-29 formations was less combat than slaughter. The B-29 raids followed a pattern. Initially, precision bombing from high altitude, target the aircraft factories, hit the steel mills, go after specific industrial facilities that intelligence identified as critical. But weather over Japan was challenging. High winds at altitude, the jet stream they'd later call it, made accurate bombing nearly impossible. Radar bombing helped, but wasn't precise. By March of 1945, the strategy shifted. General Curtis LeMay, taking command of the 20th Air Force, made a controversial decision. Strip out most of the defensive guns, reduce crew weight, load the aircraft with incendiary bombs instead of high explosives, and come in at night, at low altitude. The logic was brutal, but sound. If you can't hit specific targets accurately, burn entire cities. Japanese urban areas were perfect for firebombing. Wood and paper construction, dense populations, inadequate firefighting infrastructure. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The first low-altitude incendiary raid hit Tokyo on the night of March 9th to 10th, 1945. 279 B-29 seconds dropped 1,665 tons of incendiary bombs. 16 square miles of the city burned. 83,000 people died. 40,000 more were injured. Over 1 million were left homeless. The firestorm created winds that uprooted trees and threw burning debris for miles. Crews in the trailing B-29 seconds reported they could smell the burning city from 20,000 feet. The thermal updrafts from the fire tossed aircraft around like toys. Some B-29 seconds came back with the smell of burned flesh in their ventilation systems. For Japanese air defenses, the low-altitude raids presented a different challenge. Fighters could reach those altitudes easily. But finding bombers in the dark, over a burning city, with night vision techniques that were primitive compared to American radar? Nearly impossible. The B-29 seconds came and went. The cities burned. Japan's industrial capacity, already strained by years of war, started collapsing. The fuel advantage that had seemed abstract in November 44 became grimly concrete by spring of 45. American bombers could fly from the Marianas to Japan and back, 1,500 miles each way, carrying bomb loads that exceeded anything Japan could deliver. They could do this repeatedly, reliably, with loss rates that made the operations sustainable. Japan couldn't strike back. Their bombers lacked the range to reach American bases. Their fighters couldn't stop the raids. Their industrial capacity couldn't produce enough aircraft or fuel or ammunition to make a difference. By summer of 1945, B-29 seconds owned the sky over Japan. They flew wherever they wanted, whenever they wanted. Daylight, night, high altitude, low altitude. The raids peaked in July with over 10,000 sorties, 10,000 individual bomber missions in a single month. The numbers were staggering. Japan's cities were systematically destroyed. The industrial base that had powered the empire's expansion was gone. The transportation infrastructure was wrecked. Food supplies were failing. The population was exhausted, traumatized, and increasingly aware that continuing the war meant annihilation. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August were delivered by B-29 seconds. The Enola Gay and Bockscar, both B-2945MO models, modified to carry the special atomic weapons. But even without the atomic bombs, the B-29 campaign had effectively ended Japan's ability to wage industrial warfare. The Strategic Bombing Survey, conducted after the war, concluded that the B-29 offensive had destroyed 60% of the urban area in 66 Japanese cities. 250,000 to 900,000 people had died, depending on whose estimates you believed. Japan's war economy was destroyed. Their military remained intact in terms of troops and equipment, but couldn't operate without fuel, without ammunition, without the industrial support that modern warfare required. Japanese scientists and engineers studying the B-29 after the war were particularly struck by the fuel specifications. American aviation gasoline with octane ratings of 130 or higher wasn't just better than Japanese fuel. It was fundamentally different. The chemical processes required to produce it, the quality control needed to ensure consistency. The entire supply chain, from oil wells to aircraft tanks, represented an industrial sophistication Japan couldn't match. Even if they'd had the chemical formulas, even if they'd captured intact samples, replicating the production at scale would have required rebuilding their entire petroleum industry from scratch. In the middle of a war they were losing, with their industrial centers under constant bombardment. It wasn't going to happen. The Soviet Union reached a similar conclusion, which is why when 4 B-29 seconds made emergency landings in Soviet territory during 1944 and 45, Stalin ordered them reverse-engineered rather than returned to the Americans. The resulting Tupolev Tu-4 was essentially a bolt-for-bolt copy. The Soviets changed dimensions from imperial to metric because their aluminum supply came in different gauges. They modified some systems to match Soviet manufacturing capabilities, but the basic design remained. Even the Soviet Union, with its vast industrial resources, chose to copy the American solution rather than design their own equivalent from scratch. The legacy of the B-29 extended far beyond World War II. The same basic design, scaled up and re-engined, became the B-50 Superfortress, which made the first non-stop around-the-world flight in 1949. The airframe evolved into the C-97 Stratofreighter cargo aircraft and the Model 377 Stratocruiser airliner. The tanker versions, KB-29 and later KC-97, supported the strategic bomber force through the early Cold War. The B-29 served in combat again during the Korean War, though by then it faced a new threat. MiG-15 jet fighters could reach the B-29's operating altitude and had speed advantages that made interception much easier than anything Japanese propeller fighters could manage. 16 B-29 seconds were lost to MiG-15 seconds in Korea, a loss rate that proved the piston-engined bomber's time had passed. But in 1945, the B-29 was the ultimate expression of American industrial and technological power. It brought together high-octane fuel from advanced refineries, powerful engines that pushed the limits of radial design, airframe engineering that created a pressurized bomber the size of a small building, and manufacturing capabilities that could produce these aircraft at a rate of hundreds per month. Japan couldn't match any component of that system. Not the fuel, not the engines, not the aircraft, not the production infrastructure. The result was predictable and devastating. For Captain Sasaki and the other Japanese fighter pilots who tried to defend their homeland, the B-29 must have seemed almost incomprehensible. How could a bomber be that fast, that high, that well defended? Their own bombers were slow, vulnerable, operating at medium altitudes where any fighter could reach them. The B-29 played by different rules. It existed in a performance regime where the normal assumptions about bomber vulnerability didn't apply. Chase it, and it pulled away. Climb after it, and by the time you reached its altitude, it was miles away and accelerating. Attempt a diving attack, and the closing speed was so high you got one pass, maybe, before overshooting or getting shredded by defensive fire. Some Japanese pilots achieved notable success against B-29 seconds. The official lists credited multiple aces with 5 or more Superfortress kills. Ito Fujitaro with 17 confirmed. Shirai Nagao with 11. But these numbers, even if accurate, represented thousands of interception attempts. The loss exchange ratio heavily favored the B-29. For every Superfortress shot down, dozens completed their missions. The mathematics of attrition warfare worked entirely in America's favor. The fuel story is often overlooked in discussions of air warfare. We focus on the aircraft, on the pilots, on the tactics. But underlying all of that was a supply chain, delivering the refined petroleum products that made modern air warfare possible. High-octane aviation fuel didn't just enable better performance, it created an entire class of aircraft that simply couldn't exist without it. The B-29's engines, running on 130-octane gasoline, could maintain their rated power at altitudes where engines burning conventional fuel would struggle. That altitude capability, combined with speed, range, and payload, made strategic bombing of Japan possible. Without that fuel advantage, the Pacific War might have ended differently. Perhaps an invasion of the home islands would have been necessary. Perhaps the atomic bombs wouldn't have had B-29 seconds to deliver them. Perhaps Japan's industrial capacity would have survived long enough to make defense more viable. But these are hypotheticals. What actually happened was that American industrial chemistry, applied to petroleum refining, created fuels that powered engines that drove aircraft that burned Japan's cities and broke its will to continue fighting. The B-29 raids cost Japan its capacity to wage war, but they cost America too. 74 B-29 seconds were lost over Japan to enemy action and operational accidents. That's 74 aircraft at $639,000 each in 1944 dollars. That's 814 aircrew killed, wounded, or missing. Every mission was dangerous. Every takeoff was risky with those temperamental engines. Every long flight over the Pacific carried the possibility of navigation errors, mechanical failures, weather problems that could kill an entire crew. The B-29 campaign wasn't easy, it wasn't bloodless, but it was effective. In the decades since, aviation technology advanced beyond anything those 1940s engineers could have imagined. Jet engines, supersonic flight, precision-guided munitions. But the fundamental lesson of the B-29 campaign remained relevant. Superior technology, powered by superior industrial capacity, creates military advantages that tactics alone cannot overcome. Japan couldn't outfly, outfight, or outproduce the American strategic bombing campaign. They could only endure it until it destroyed their ability to resist. The image of silver B-29 seconds cruising untouched over Japanese cities, dropping their payloads while defensive fighters struggled fruitlessly to intercept, symbolized the end of the Pacific War. When those bombers appeared overhead, filled with high-octane fuel pumped from refineries half a world away, they carried more than bombs. They carried the accumulated weight of American industrial might. Every gallon of 130-octane fuel represented a supply chain Japan couldn't replicate. Every hour of engine operation demonstrated engineering Japan couldn't match. Every completed mission proved the inevitable outcome of industrial warfare between unequal powers. Captain Sasaki survived the war. His Ki-44 didn't. After multiple intercept attempts that accomplished nothing except wearing out his aircraft, he transitioned to other duties. The fighter was scrapped for parts that were desperately needed elsewhere. By April of 1945, Japanese airfields were being bombed regularly. By June, the remaining fighters were being preserved for kamikaze operations against the expected American invasion. By August, the war was over. In the post-war years, Sasaki spoke occasionally about his experiences attempting to intercept B-29 seconds. The frustration was evident. Not frustration with his own skill or courage. Frustration with the fundamental impossibility of the task. You can't catch what you can't reach. You can't reach what operates in a performance regime your aircraft can't access. And you can't access those regimes without the fuel that makes them possible. The B-29 didn't just fly higher and faster than Japanese fighters. It flew in a different world, powered by chemistry and industry, that represented the gap between two nations' capabilities. The bomber offensive against Japan was controversial then, and remains debated now. The moral implications of area bombing, of deliberately targeting civilian populations, of using incendiary weapons that caused mass casualties. These questions don't have easy answers. But from a purely technical and strategic perspective, the B-29 campaign demonstrated what modern warfare had become: industrial capacity, translated into technological advantage, applied with overwhelming force. Japan laughed at the B-29, initially, or at least refused to believe it could be as capable as American propaganda claimed. Then, they experienced it. The laughter stopped quickly. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.